Introducing the new Warrior XL sawmill from Hud-son Forest Equipment. The new upgrades are 19-inch band wheels and all metal guards, which gives you a thicker cutting capacity when cutting large timbers. We recommend assembly with 2 people. It's safer, quicker, and a lot more fun, and some of the parts are so heavy that you need 2 people to actually move them safely. First thing you want to do is dismantle a crate and separate all your boxes in a larger area where your parts can be laid out and seen plainly while you're assembling the mill. 2 guys will be needed to remove the motor, the track, and the frame from the pallet assembly. Your sawmill was shipped with the guards attached to the frame. Remove the guards before taking it off the pallet. Then cut the straps and release the mill frame from the base pallet. With 2 people, remove the mill off the pallet and set it on a level area. After removing the mill from the pallet, the mill head may be stuck from sitting and shipping. You need to lubricate the 2 slide bars to raise and lower the head. Once you lubricate the bars, step on each side of the mill and raise the head up to make sure it moves freely. Lift evenly on both sides when attempting this. Here's a list of all the tools required. Take the parts box first. Open your boxes one by one, lay the parts out. All the bags are marked with the parts inside. Clearly lay out all the part bags. The first step assembling the sawmill is installing the winch on the frame. Locate the hardware kit marked winch hardware in your bolt. There should be 3 bolts. You'll have the flat washers, lock washers, and nuts. Put a flat washer on each bolt, slide it through the winch, install the winch on the inside of the frame. Install the flat washers, the nylock nuts, and tighten them all up. The next step is installing the crank onto the winch. First thing you're going to do is get the vice grips and lock them onto the shaft that the crank handle screws onto to secure it. So when you screw the crank handle on, snug that up. Get the hardware from the packet. It's going to be a large flat washer, a shim spacer, a spring, and a smaller washer. Assemble it in that order. Screw it into the end of the shaft where you screwed the crank handle on and snug it up tightly. The next step is installing the lift system for your sawmill. Locate the package of hardware with the lift cables, eyebolts, and lift pulleys in there. There are 3 cable pulley assemblies, 2 singles and 1 double pulley assembly. The nylon washer goes on first, then the cable pulley, another nylon washer. When you get to the double cable pulley assembly, the nylon washer goes between the 2 pulleys so there's no friction against each pulley rub. One of the single cable pulleys assemblies has a longer bolt. That assembly uses a thicker washer as shown. Now we're going to install the double pulley system on the mill head. Slide the double pulley system off the bolt that you had pre-set up, slide it into the bracket on the mill, and slide the bolt back through the pulleys, being sure that you don't drop any of the shims or the nylon washers out when sliding the bolt through. When you get the bolt through, you're going to put 2 washers on the other side, a large one and a small one. The larger one goes against the frame on the mill. The smaller one goes against that washer. Snug up the bolt nice and tight. The pulley should turn freely after tightening up the bolt. Now move to the other side of the mill and add in the single pulley. Same setup, drop the bolt down through, make sure that the nylon shims are on either side of the pulley. If the bolt protrudes through the bracket farther than the thickness of one of your 9/16 washers, use the second 9/16 washer to take up that space. Add the small washer after that, tighten up the bolt, and your cable pulley should turn freely on that bolt. Now we'll put the last cable wheel on. This uses the 3-inch long bolt with the thick shim we spoke about earlier on our setup. The shim goes against the frame of the mill, the nylon washer between the cable, pulley, and the thick washer. After tightening, make sure it spins freely. Next step is installing the eye bolts. Secure the 2 eye bolts from your kit. Find the nuts, the 1/2-inch nuts, and screw them all the way near the top, leaving 1 inch of thread exposed from the eyelet down to the top of the nut. This is for future adjustment on the mill once we get everything set. Next, you're going to secure the flat washer and put it up against the nut on the eye bolt. The eye bolts are installed in the bracket next to the lift tube on each side of the mill head. Secure one more flat washer, lock washer, and nut. Do not move the top nut, tighten the bottom one up to the top nut. The eye bolt should be parallel with the track after you're done tightening it up. Repeat the same steps on the other side. Next, we're going to install the winch cables. Secure the long cable with the pre-made eyelet in the end of it. Feed the looped end of the cable between the winch drum and the winch plate. Line it up with the hole for the mounting of the eyelet. Slide the bolt through the eyelet and the winch drum. Put the clip on there and then tighten the nut up. Tighten up the bolt securely. The clamp on the cable may rub against the side of the winch, so you may have to tap that in a little bit just to form the cable so that it doesn't rub on the casing of the winch. Once you do that, feed the cable through the eyelet next to the securing bolt where you just put it in there. Then feed the cable up through the first cable pulley on the angled bracket across from the winch. Then run the cable across the top of the mill and over the top of the inside pulley. That's the pulley you're going to be pulling from on that cable. Run it down to the eyelet on that side of the mill head. Before putting the cable through the eyelet, slide your cable clamp onto the cable. Slide the cable through the eyelet from the inside to the outside so your tail of the cable is toward the outside of the mill. Slide the cable up through the cable clamp. Make sure when installing the cable clamps you put the nuts on the load side of the cable. That's the part of the cable that's going to be carrying the load. Snug it up so you can still move the cable. Go over to the winch and start cranking the winch to take up the slack in the cable. When you get all the slack taken up coming down to the clamp, you want about a 6-inch tail. Now install the second cable clamp just above the first one. Remember when installing your cable clamps to put the saddle on the load side of your cable. Now we're installing the second cable. Feed it up through the bottom of the double pulley assembly. Clamp it as close to the double pulley assembly as you can. Secure a second clamp and put it right next to your first one on the inside closer to the pulleys. Keep them tight to the pulleys as you can get them. Then feed the cable across the mill, keeping it snug over the top of the other pulley that's bolted to the frame. Then go down to the eyelet on the other side of the sawmill. Again, feed from the inside to the outside so the tail of the cable is on the outside of the mill. Slide your cable clamps on, keeping one side of the cable taut with a pair of vice grips or your helper pulling on it good and tight. Slide the cable clamp all the way down to the eyelet and snug it up, making sure that your nuts are on the load side of the cable again with your cable clamp. Put a second one on there, about a 1/2 inch apart on spacing on those two. After securing the cable clamps and tightening them up good and secure, leave about a 6-inch tail and cut the end of that cable right off. Okay, next we're installing the track wheels. Find the track wheel kit that has the hardware in it, the 4 bolts and the washers. Look at your track wheel. You're going to see a snap ring on one side of the track wheel. That side goes toward the head of the bolt. Slide the 2 small washers on after you slide the track wheel on the bolt, then 1 large washer. Repeat that assembly for all 4 bolts. Now we're going to install the track wheels on the mill using your 1.1/8" socket and an impact wrench. Place the bolt through the hole in the outside of the frame and secure the track wheel to the frame. Tighten it up as far as you can, making sure the wheel will still spin. We are looking for a measurement of 34 3/4 inches, hooking your tape on the outside of one wheel to the inside of the other wheel. If you don't achieve that measurement on the first try, we may have to pull off one of the shim washers or add one if you're too far. Once you get the correct measurement of 34 3/4 inches from outside to inside of each wheel, then move to the other side and install the wheels in the same manner. Do the same thing on the other end of the mill. If you pull a shim washer off from one side on the first set, make sure that you pull that same shim washer off on the other side if necessary. Now we're going to set up the track to get the mill frame set on. Make sure your track is level. That is key in setting up the mill. If your floor is unlevel, get some shim so you can level the track. We prefer you use a 6-foot level when leveling your track. It needs to be leveled from side to side and from end to end. Once you get your track level, you need to install your track stops on each end of the mill. After your track has been leveled up, now it's time to put the mill onto the track. Lift the front of the mill up, drag it forward, set your first 2 wheels onto the track, go to the rear, raise up the mill head, and slide it on forward. Be sure to block the wheels. Make sure that the mill head cannot roll off the track before putting the track stops on. Now that the mill head is placed on the track, we're installing the track stops. Secure the track stop kit that's in your hardware kit. There should be 1-inch bolt that goes through the track frame first. Put the track stop on the inside of the frame with the bolt facing inward. Put the nut on and tighten. I leave the track stops a little bit loose, so if I need to flip it out of the way, it's a lot easier during assembly. You don't have to keep tightening and loosening the track stops. You're going to put the track stops on both ends of the track just to prevent the mill from ever rolling off during your assembly procedure. Once you have the track stops on, snug the mill to the rear pushed against the stops, and take a pair of vice grips and lock it onto the track so that the mill cannot roll during your assembly procedure. Next, we're going to be installing the off-deck bolts. They're 2 inches long. They're in the kit marked off-deck bolts with the nut. The nut is a locking jam nut. Raise the head up about midway of the frame. Once you get it up to there, it's a lot easier to work on these bolts. They're on the bottom tab on the guide tube. Screw the bolt up through, leaving 1.1/8 inches of the bolt exposed from the tab down to the inside of the head. Once you get that measurement, this is just a setup. Put your lock nut on there, tighten it up just snug so it doesn't turn and fall out of there. Repeat the same thing on the other side, making sure your measurement is accurate. 1.1/8 inches from the tab to the inside of the head of the bolt. Our next step is installing the bearing adjusting bolts. Secure the 4 adjusting bolts. When you're assembling these, you're going to put 2 washers on first, then a nut. The head of the bolt is going to be pressed against the bearing to make the adjustments. Once you slide the bolt through the hole, put another washer on and then the other nut. Repeat this on both sides of the mill and at both ends of the mill. Okay, our next step is installing the main bearings and band wheels. When you unpacked your mill, you probably noticed that you had 2 band wheels there. The single pulley is for the idler end of your mill, which is the tensioner side, The shaft with the double pulleys goes on your drive side, so that's going to have the longer bolts out of your bolt kit for that side. The shorter bolts are for the idler side. Separate all your hardware, put the flat washers on each bolt. You're going to notice in the hardware kit there's thick washers and thin ones. The thin ones go in the head of the bolt, the thick ones are going to go on the bottom. Okay, after you've separated all your hardware and got the washers on the bolts, get your short bolts. We're going to put the idler wheel on first, which is your tensioner end. Single pulley, drop all your bolts in the holes, secure your pulley with the bearings mounted on it. The easiest way is to sit on your chair and hold it up with your knees as shown here in the video. Once you get it up there, just hold it and start all your nuts and washers. The thick washer goes up against the bearing, then put on your lock washer, then the nut. After you get all your bolts in, snug them up just snug, and you're going to notice that you may have to align the bearings with the head. Just take a hammer and lightly tap to self-align them bearings. They will swivel on the shaft. They're self-aligning bearings, so just tap them and get them straight with the frame. Now that we've got the bearings squared up with the frame, we need to check the wheel for plumbness. Take your level, put it on the band wheel, and make sure that it's level or plumb up and down, straight. If the band wheel is not plumb up and down, then we'd have to put one of the shims under the bearing that was supplied with the mill kit. Okay, at this time our band wheel assembly is still loose on the frame, so we're going to get it ready and tighten it up. But we've got to check a few things. Make sure that it's square with the frame. You can see it moves around. Then we're going to measure from the inside of the frame to the edge of the wheel, and we're looking for a distance of 7/8 of an inch. Put your tape against the pulley, hold it up there, and look at 7/8 looking right down the edge of the frame there. Once you achieve that, make sure it doesn't move, and then go ahead and tighten up the bearing bolts. Do one side at a time, and when you're tightening it, make sure that the wheel does not move. Once you get done tightening it, check it and make sure that it stayed at 7/8 on that front side. Next step installing this band wheel assembly is to set the set screws on the collars for the bearings, the locking collar on the bearing. We're going to come back and set them with a drill later, but we need to snug everything up tight right now to get everything aligned and set up. Here in this shot we are showing you the bushing for the band wheel. Do not make any adjustments on those. Those are preset at the factory. Then we're going to put the Loctite right on the locking collar set screws against the band wheel itself. There's one on each side. Pull the screw out, clean it off, put some Loctite on it. Put that collar right tight to the pulley, as tight as you can get it. Make sure it's offset from the keyway in the shaft and lock it right on there. Okay, next we're going to be installing the main bearings on the drive side with the band wheel. This side has 2 pulleys on it. Came shipped like that. We have to remove the main drive pulley from that shaft. There's a set screw in the collar on the drive pulley. Loosen that set screw and it should slide right off. Then the bearings have to be straightened up. They may be cocked a little bit, but them are self-aligning bearings. Tap them with a mallet, get them as straight as you can on the shaft. Then we're going to go right ahead, set our bolts in the frame, the long bolts from our kit. Set the band wheel up into place just like we did on the other side. Set it on your knees, lift it right up into place and hold it. Make sure you put the thick washer against the bearing, then the lock washer, then the nut. Hold it as straight as you can and snug everything up. Once you get everything snugged up, double check it for squareness against the frame. We're going to measure again from the inside of the frame to the edge of the band wheel and double check your distance when tightening the bolts. Okay, after snugging up the wheel tight with them bearings, we need to check the wheel for plumb like we did on the other side. Go ahead, get your level on it and check this wheel for plumbness as well. This side is off a little bit here in our video, so we're going to have to add in a shim. So you just loosen up one side whichever side you need to move the wheel at the top or bottom. Just tap the bearing down a little bit, pull your bolts out, and slide the shims in, or shim. Snug it back up there, tighten everything back up, make sure that your wheel is straight with the frame as you're tightening things. Now that we've added the shim, we're going to check it for plumb again. It's perfect, so now we're going to go ahead and you can tighten up the bolts again, but go back and verify your distance on the front of that band wheel to the frame again. Okay, now we've got the wheel straight and plumb up and down, all of our bolts tightened down on the bearings. We're going to go ahead and do the lock collars just like we did on the other side. We're going to lock tight the inner collars against the pulley so that those can't move. So go ahead and lock tight those in, make sure they're offset from your keyway. And then we're going to just tighten the set screws on the locking collars on the bearings. Do not put no Loctite in those yet. On this drive wheel setup, the locking collar is on the outside of the bearing. Okay, now that we have the band wheels all aligned, we're going to countersink the bearings on the shaft so that they cannot slide or spin on the inside of the bearing. There's going to be 4 set screws on each end of the mill, 2 on each side on each bearing. You want to make sure that the set screw is not on the keyway that's in the shaft. So set one above it or one below it. These are all preset at the factory, so you shouldn't have to worry too much, but always check before you do it. Remove the set screw on the top 2 first. Next, we're going to drill in the set hole for the screws in the shaft. This prevents the shaft from sliding inside the bearing or spinning inside the bearing. Use your 3/16 bit. Hold your wheel nice and tight so it can't roll on you when you're trying to drill it. Be careful not to hit the threads for your set screw. When setting these set screws, drill into your shaft about 1/8 of an inch to create the dimple to set the set screw in. Then you want to clean off the oil that's on the set screw that you took out. Then put your Loctite on, put it back in there and lock it in nice and tight. Next, you're going to do the same thing on the next 2. Just turn your wheel and do the next 2 set screws the same way. Okay, now we're going to move to the other side of the mill and tighten up and lock tight the set screws on these bearings. Remember, on this side the bearing is facing outward and not inward on the one side, and that's normal. It stays like that. Then go ahead, remove your set screws, drill it, remove your oil, Loctite it, and lock them in good and tight. Make sure you do all 4 set screws on each end. Now we're going to be checking the band wheel alignment just before we put our blade on. So we take our straight edge, we got to have a long level, it works best. Go from one band wheel to the other, and they should be touching at 4 points on each side of the band wheel on both wheels. If it's out of alignment a little bit, because we did make the measurement off the frame, just loosen your bearing bolts and make that come in straight so they both come in alignment together. Once you've done that, go ahead and retighten all your bearing bolts. As you can see here, we got it in straight. Next, we're going to install the Zerk grease fittings on each side of the tensioner end of your band wheel assembly. This allows grease to get in on the sliders so you can, when loosening and tensioning the blade. When installing the Zerk fittings, you can make a tool. Sometimes you can use a hardwood block, or you can go to the hardware store and buy a tool. They're pretty simple to put in as long as you put good steady pressure on and tap them in nice and snug. Once you get your grease fittings in, go ahead and grease them. 4 squirts per grease fitting. Go right around and grease all 4 of them. Once you get all 4 grease fittings greased, Smear a little grease on the ends of the sliders on all three sides so that they slide in and out easily. Then go ahead and grab the bearings on each side and work that assembly in and out a couple times. Make sure it moves nice and freely. Okay, the next step is mounting the blade on the band mill so we can get it aligned before we mount the motor. So be careful handling these blades. They're very sharp and they will cut you in a split second. Make sure you're wearing gloves when you're handling the blade. The easiest way to uncoil it is to take it out of the box, get a little bit of loop started, and step on it with your foot, and then slowly uncoil the blade, standing up with it. Be careful not to cut yourself or let it come slinging back at you. They have a lot of tension in them. Once you get the blade uncoiled, pinch it together in the middle. Then we're going to clean the oil off the blade before we put it on the band wheels. Even when you're running brand new blades and you're cutting, you'll always want to clean the oil off the blade before you put it on the mill. So with the teeth facing away from you, hold the band blades, just let the bottom rest, pull it through with the teeth facing away from you. Take it around one whole loop and make sure you get it all off. Once we get the oil off the blade, we can put it onto the mill. Now we're going to put the blade onto the band wheels. Hook it over the one end of your frame, just inside that bolt, on the guard bolt. Bring it slowly to the other end and seat it over your band wheel. You want to try and keep the blade flush with the back side of the band wheel when you're doing that. Just let it hang there, then move to the other side, work it over onto the band wheel. Make sure that you put the blade underneath the guard brackets that are on top. You'll see there's two flat brackets with bolts sticking out, them are guard brackets. The blade has to go underneath those. Slide it onto the wheel. Get the back flush with the band wheel again. Back of the blade should always be flush with the back side of the band wheel. Next, move to the other side of the mill and grab the band wheel right in the center with both hands and give it a good tug backwards, and that'll snap your blade up good and snug so that it's taut just before we put in the tensioner bolt to make the adjustment for tension. Go ahead and secure your tensioner bolt. It's about 8 inches long, 1 inch in diameter, and it got an 1 3/8 hex head on it. Grease that up good before you put it in there so we get the proper torque when we're setting the torque on the blade. When you put the bolt all the way through the nut, grab a little grease off the end or the threads and put right at the end of the bolt and on that plate that it's pushing up against. That also reduces friction when you're setting the torque on your blade. Go ahead and thread that tensioner bolt in until it starts to push on that tensioner plate. Just get a little tension on the blade so it's snug. Don't torque it up at all. Before we torque the blade, we want to make sure we got our bearings all set and properly torqued on the bolts. So we're going to check them. They should be torqued at 75 foot-pounds. Set your torque wrench at 75 foot-pounds. Go around each bolt on the bearings for the mill head. Make sure they're all torqued at 75. The torque on your saw blade is 35 foot-pounds. Okay, now we're going to adjust the locking bolts on the band wheel bearings. So first go around and snug all 4 of the bearing lock bolts tight to the bearing. Just get them up there snug so we can make adjustments as we're looking at the band blade go around the wheels. Now you're going to come around and spin your band wheel in the direction that the blade will be cutting in. Give it about 3 turns around and check the back side of the band wheel to the blade and see if they are flush. Right here you can see they are not flush, so we're going to have to make the adjustment. So now go ahead and loosen up the bearing just a crack so that we can move it a little bit, because we've got it torqued, so we got to have it loose so we can move it. Then make the adjustment on your bearing adjuster bolt, which you're either going to push the bearing backwards to make the wheel move a little bit or let it come forward. Depends on which side you move and how far you have to move it. This should be just a slight movement on the bearing, not much at all. Spin the band wheel again, it comes out flush. Then go ahead and re-torque your bolts to the proper torque setting. Once you get the idler side set, now we're going to come over to the drive side and we're going to do the same thing. Spin your band wheel 3 times. If it's off a little bit, loosen up your bearing, make the proper adjustment. Go ahead and tighten it back down and check it. Should be right flush to the back of the band wheel as shown. Next we're going to do the engine setup. First we got to put the oil in the engine. The oil is shipped with the engine. There should be 2 quarts. Pull out your dipstick, wipe it off clean, put it back in, but don't seat it all the way. Just leave a little bit so the air can get out when you're pouring in the oil. Go ahead and pour in your first quart. Once you get the first quart in, check your oil level. It's going to be low. You're going to use just about all of the 2 quarts, but when you're putting in your second quart, get 2/3 of it in and do a check on your engine. It should be up to full. If it is, you're good to go. Next on the setup for the engine, we're going to install the clutch. You're going to secure the clutch hardware kit. Should have the washers, the shim washers, the washers for the bolt that hold on the clutch and the keyway. First put on your 2 big washers. Those are the spacer washers to get the proper spacing for your clutch distance. Slide your clutch on, do a test fit, pull it back off, and then you're going to set the keyway in there. Set the keyway into the shaft all the way, tap it in with your mallet, make sure it's seated properly. Then slide your clutch onto the shaft with the keyway lining. Secure your bolt that holds the clutch onto the shaft. Lock washer on first, small flat washer, then your expanded serrated washer or cup washer. Put a little Loctite on the end of that bolt, and when you tighten this up, if you don't have an impact wrench, you can torque that to about 28 to 32 pounds, right in that range, and make sure that it's seated properly. We want to make sure we don't over tighten this clutch bolt. Watch for the lock washer to flatten out when you're doing your tightening, and when that's flattened out, your torque is sufficient. Next we're going to install the muffler on the motor. Secure your muffler kit in the hardware kit. It's all should be in the same box. Peel the tape off the engine block that's over the manifold holes. The gaskets were in the kit. Slide the gaskets over the studs. Make sure that they're clean. Secure your muffler. Slide it onto the studs. There should be a lock washer and a nut that goes on each stud. Torque setting for these manifold bolts should be 23 foot-pounds. Tighten them up securely, and your muffler should be in place. After the regulator, now we're going to install the master switch. Secure that from your parts box. When you install that, just line up the 2 holes. If you want, test fit your key in the slot before you secure it all the way on. The key should be at about a 2 o'clock position. That makes it more user friendly. Once you get the key bolted in, then we can secure the key itself to the unit so you don't lose the master switch key. We just drill a hole next to the master key switch and secure it with the screws provided. Next we're going to mount the engine into the sawmill. It's a lot easier with 2 guys, and preferably to use 2 guys to set it in there. Set the engine first onto the lube tank bracket or the gas tank bracket. Have the other guy go inside the mill frame and help lift it and set it onto the motor mounting bracket. Once you get the motor set on the bracket, carefully raise the head up, bring it up about halfway. It makes it a lot easier to make your wire connections. When you make your wire connections from your voltage regulator, just follow the color codes. White's going to go to white. There's going to be 2 gray wires So it's going to go gray to gray and gray to gray. And then you've got a yellow and black wire, and yellow and black goes to yellow and black. You're going to have one extra wire that doesn't mean nothing. That's the white one with the red stripes. The wire with the big eyelet is going to be your grounding wire for your charging unit. So that one is going to actually go to the motor mount itself when you put in the motor mount bolt. Next, we're going to bolt the motor down onto the unit, but we're going to start with the grounding bolt. This bolt grounds the battery and the motor to the regulator. First, we're going to put on the big cable for the battery. That's the black heavy cable that came with your kit. Then you're going to put on the voltage regulator eyelet that was with that regulator, had the big eyelet on it. Put on a flat washer on top of that one, and then put the nut on. You don't have to tighten it up at this time. We're going to put in the other bolts first, and then we'll come back through and tighten everything up. Once you get that bolt in position, move your wires around so they're not going to be in the way and there's not going to be excess tension on them. Now we're going to put in the rest of the engine bolts. When you're setting the bolts in there, make sure you got the washers on the head of the bolt underneath the motor mount bracket. Make sure the washer is on top of the engine, fastening it down, and put your nut on. Before you snug anything down, you want to move the motor as far forward as you can, but make sure your bolts are staying straight and aligned. You want to push the motor to the right and watch your motor mount. You're going to be about 3/4 of an inch from the end of that motor mount bracket to the base frame on the motor. Okay, now make sure your engine doesn't move, and then go ahead and start and tightening up all your bolts on your motor mount. Don't torque them at this time, just snug them up good and snug so it's not going to move. Next, we're going to install the drive pulley. Before we do that, we want to remove the blade just for safety's sake. It makes it a lot easier when we're lining things up here. So loosen up your tensioner bolt, back it all the way off. Once you get it backed all the way off, take your foot, put a little tension on the bottom of the blade, and pull your idler wheel in and slack your blade right up. Remove your blade and put it in a secure place. Usually hanging on the wall is the best way with the teeth pointing inward. Now secure your drive wheel that you took off from the shaft before we mounted the bearing. Slide the keyway onto the shaft. Make sure that the bushing is straight in the pulley when you're putting it on. Line up the keyway onto the bushing. Slide it onto the shaft. Make sure your keyway is all the way into the bushing. Once we get that lined up, you're going to get a straight bar or a string line, and you need to line up with the motor next. So you're going to put that bar against the pulley, and we want to see about 1/4 inch between the pulley on the motor off that bar down to the drive pulley. Once we get that set distance, tighten the set screw on the bushing against the shaft on the drive pulley. Once you've tightened the set screw onto the shaft on the bushing, now we're going to tighten up the 3 bolts on that bushing collar. And you need to turn them evenly all at the same time. So do a 1/2 turn on each bolt as you go around. Draw them in evenly. When they start to get snug, then we're going to check the wheel for balance and make sure that it spins evenly and does not wobble. The collar will not come tight to the pulley when you're tightening them bolts. Once your wheel is spinning true, then we have to torque the bolts. The torque setting on them 3 bolts is 15 foot-pounds. The bar should be against the drive pulley, and it should touch on the outside edge of the clutch, just as you see here in the video. This will be a nice straight line. If you're using a string line, it should be square against both sides of your drive pulley and touching right at the clutch at the motor. Okay, now we're going to install the drive belt. Grab that out of your kit, put it over the clutch on the motor first, seat it in the groove, make sure it's straight. Then you're going to come down, keep it taut, and go on the bottom side of the drive pulley. And then turn your pulley until it comes up taut right about there. Right there we use what we call as a 2-finger rule for tension when we're setting things up. So use your 2 fingers in there as you see here in the video. If it's about that distance, your tension is going to be good once you roll it up onto the pulley the rest of the way. If it's good there, go ahead and roll the pulley, and the belt will go right up onto the pulley and seat right in there nicely. Should turn freely. Check it for snugness. The spacing that we did on the motor earlier on the setup, that dictates the tension on the belt. If you need to reset the tension on the belt, you need to loosen up all 4 bolts on your motor mount and slide it in the proper direction. Next, we're going to install the battery. Secure your battery facing with the positive side to your right against the metal bracket on the frame. Then get your strap, put the strap around the battery, snug it up tight, and cut the length. Once you got your battery secure in position, we're going to mount the wires. First, we're going to mount the ground wire, the one coming from the motor mount. We're going to mount that onto the left side of the master key switch. Then you're going to have another black wire in your kit, and that one we're going to put on the other post of that master key switch. At this time, we're not going to hook it to the battery. We're just going to secure it onto the switch and leave it set there. Secure your red wire and go right up to your motor on the starter. You're going to see a bolt there, and take that top bolt off, put the washer back on, tighten up that nut. Then you're going to bring that wire down and hook it up to your battery. Once you get everything hooked up, slide your boots over the caps of the wires and give them some protection. After your positive side is hooked up and secured, then go over to your negative and ground wire and make that final connection there to your battery. Tighten up that bolt. Then we're going to test the connection. So we're just going to put the key in the master switch and turn it on. And then we just want to grab the key ignition on the motor and bump the starter. Just turn it to start and make sure you got power to the motor. After you do your power test, make sure you shut your master key off and pull the key out of the ignition. Next, we're installing the fuel tank. Secure your tank, and when you put it into the fuel tank bracket on the machine, make sure that the red nozzle is pointing inward toward the motor. That's your on-off for your fuel. Secure the 2 straps provided with your kit. Secure it into the bracket, nice and snugly. Then we're going to put the fuel line on. Raise your head up a little way so it's a little more comfortable to work on. Get your piece of hose that's provided. It should be cut to length. Put it onto the filter that's already on the motor, and then slip it onto the tank on the red nozzle there where you see the brass fitting. Go ahead and lower the head all the way down, and we're going to put some gas in the machine. Fire it up. So fill her up with some gas, at least a half a tank or so, enough to get it running. The red knob on the top is your on-off. When the tab is pointing upward, the fuel is on. When it's turned sideways, the fuel is off. Go ahead and crank your throttle up about just above minimum. Pull your choke out. It's going to take a little bit to get the gas up into the motor, so pull your choke. Make sure your master key is in and on. You get power to your motor and crank her over until it fires up. If it doesn't fire up within 20 or 30 seconds of cranking, give your motor a break and try it again. Don't burn up your starter. Once your motor starts up, let it run for about a minute to warm up at low idle. You don't want to rev it right up immediately. Then slowly rev up the engine. Your clutch should engage and start turning the drive pulley down below. When your motor's at low idle, the drive pulley should not be turning, your clutch shouldn't be engaged. So then once you get it warmed up, rev it right up to the top end, and we want to look at our belt. And what we're looking for is to make sure that the belt is aligned properly when it's running and it doesn't flip over. If it's not aligned properly, it will flip over in the pulley. Everything looks good just like that. Once we've test run the mill, now we're going to shut her down and install the blade. Put the blade back on, hook it on the end, keep it taut, pull it over your band wheel on the other end, and make sure you go under your blade guard brackets on top. Bring it down on the bottom, come back to the other side, slip it over your band wheel, make sure your back of the blade is flush with your band wheel. Go around to your adjuster side, grab it with 2 hands and give it a quick pull back so we got some tension on it. And then we're going to put the tensioner bolt back up there and bring it up to tension. We're going to set our tension at 35 foot-pounds like it's supposed to be at. Once we get our tension set, we're going to roll that blade around and double check it. Make sure you roll it in the direction that it's going to be cutting in, so the teeth are hooking inward. Roll it about 3 times around and make sure that your blade is still aligned on the back side of your band wheels on both sides. Once we've got our blade on the mill, now we're going to install the plastic caps over the holes on the ends of the mills on the tubing. You got them on the bottom there next to your track wheels. Just set them in there and tap them in with your hammer lightly. At the top, you got one there in the center on the frame, just in front of the motor. Once you get all those in, we can move on to the next step. Now we're going to set our off-deck distance from the blade to the cross members. Roll your mill forward and get the blade over a cross member, and we're going to measure from the bottom side of the blade to the top of the cross member. Should be 1 inch on each side of the mill. Once you achieve that measurement on each side, go ahead and lock your locking nuts on top, and that should be in position. Now we're going to install the guide bars. Make sure when you're installing your guide bar that you have the bolt facing upward and the large hole going horizontal. You got a long guide bar and a short guide bar, and the short guide bar is the fixed guide bar. The long is the adjustable guide bar. So secure that and raise your head up. It's a lot easier to work on. When you got your head up, you want to check your blade for levelness. If the mill is level on the track, everything's going to show up level here again. Check that for level and set your level up onto the guide bar. Once you make sure your bolt is tight, your T-handle bolt, what secures that in place, is tight whenever you're adjusting the guide. That looks good there. Next up, we're going to install the measuring bar or scale stick. Secure it from your kit with the hardware. Sometimes you may have to clean a little powder coating out of the holes if necessary. Mount it to the side of the frame on the operator's side near the battery. There's 2 holes on the frame. Line up the 2 bolt holes, put your bolts in there, flat washers, and your nuts. Snug it up, not tightly, but leave it a little bit loose, and look at the side of it up the tube on the mill frame. Make sure that it's parallel with that tube so it's straight up and down. That's a good guide to use. Then tighten it right up and it should be in position. Now that our scale stick is mounted on the mill, we're going to put on the sight glass. Secure that from your kit. You want to mount it about 1/2 or 3/8 of an inch away from the scale stick on the top of the mill. Make a center punch mark, center that on the top of the frame. Center punch it, drill it with the 1/8 drill bit. Then run your screw in there to get it self-tapped. Pull your screw back out. Then mount your sight glass bracket onto the mill head. Again, set it so it's about 1/2 an inch or 3/8 away from the scale stick. Now we're going to adjust the lift on the cables for the head so that the head lifts evenly on both sides when we crank up the winch. If you go to your winch now and crank on it, watch your scale stick, and if it moves to the left or to the right, that's telling you that the head is not lifting evenly on both sides. It's moving to the right. So we're going to move the left side of the mill because that side is pulling a little bit tighter, and that's why that stick is moving outward. So now we're going to go to the left side of the mill on the adjusting bolt for the cable where the eyelet is. To make that adjustment, we're going to take the tension off the cable. We're going to go over to the left side of the mill to our adjusting bolt. We're going to loosen the bottom nut and move it down about 1/4 of an inch. And then we're going to tighten the top nut back up to that. And what we're doing is extending that cable up a little bit so that it doesn't pull as tight when we start to lift the head. Once we get that set, we're going to tighten that right back up. And we're going to go back over and we're going to check our winch again. We're going to crank up the head and see if it comes up evenly. This may take a few times when you're doing it, so be patient with it. And when you get that stick coming up straight, you know you got both of your cables adjusted exactly even. So now as you can see, when we crank up the head for the sawmill, that bar stays nice and perpendicular. It doesn't move to the left or to the right. Next, we're going to be installing the blade guides. We've already installed the blade guide bars. We have the blade guide pins and we have the blade guide assembly. So there's 3 components to your blade guides. First step installing the blade guides is set the fixed blade guide bar out 2 1/4 inches from the frame. Tighten the locking bolt on the back side so it cannot move. Now we're going to install the guide pins. When we install the guide pins, the movable blade guide pin, that is going to be fixed toward the outside edge of the mill. So that's going to be facing to the left. The offset on the right side is going to be facing to the right. Just put them in there and snug up that little bolt on top that holds them in position. Now we have to remove the guide shoes from the guide block assembly. Remove the Allen screw from the front of the guide shoes and take the nut off the back. Once we get it dismantled, we're going to install it onto the mill. Okay, we're looking for a distance of 1/8 of an inch between the guide bearing and the back edge of the blade. You see that little piece of metal's tab there sliding? That's the space we're looking for. Right there he's using a metal shim to get the spacing correct. And he sets it about 3/16 away. And that should be the proper setting. Once we get that distance, we want to make sure that that bearing is centered on the blade as you're seeing right here. And to achieve that, you can just rotate the pin to get it to center on where you need it. Once you get it centered, lock that into position on the guide bar for the distance and for the squareness. Go on ahead on the other side, remove the guide shoes head assembly and put it on in the same manner. Again, center the blade on the guide bearing behind it. Okay, when you're centering that bearing with your guide block, all you got to do is rotate that guide pin that you put in, and that sets the height of the guide block with the bearing mounted to it to get it centered on your blade. Then snug it up so it stays in position. Now that we've got the guide blocks in position, we want to check them and make sure that they're plumb up and down so that they'll be square with the blade. If the guide block is not exactly plumb, tap it with your mallet and bring it into position. Make sure that it's nice and plumb. Now that we have both of our guide blocks plumb, we're going to install the guide shoes. There's 2 components. There's a lower guide shoe and an upper guide shoe bracket. The shoe is fastened to the bracket. So we're going to slide the bottom one up in first, then we're going to slide the top one over into the slot, install the Allen head screw, and slide the nut down the slot in the back. That keeps the nut from turning so you don't have to hold it with a wrench when you're making adjustments. Then we're going to set the space of the guides onto the blade, which is critical. You don't want to pinch that too tight. The best way to do it for amateurs is to use a piece of paper between the guide shoe and the blade on each side. Just hold them up snug and then tighten them up. After we get them tight, we're going to make sure that the adjustable guide will slide back and forth on the blade nice and freely. If it's pinching too tight, you won't be able to move it, and the blade will want to move with the guide when you slide the adjustable guide bar. Now that our guide shoes are adjusted and it's not pinching on the blade, we can move the arm freely back and forth without friction. Next, we want to do a couple checks with the sliding guide bar. Just move it in a couple positions along the blade and tighten up the T-handle. When you do this, look at the guide at the end and make sure that the blade does not move up or down. Next, we're installing the lube line kit. It comes with a hose, the brackets, the guide bracket, and clips. First, we're going to install the guide tube bracket that mounts onto the guide block. Make sure when you install it, it goes onto the adjustable guide arm and the tube is pointing down and to the left onto the blade. A little Loctite on the bolt and tighten that right up. Next, go ahead and secure your lube tank. You may want to put your decals on before we put it on, but go ahead. It goes in the bracket a little bit tight, so you may want a screwdriver and push on to one side. As you pry it right in there, it'll slip right in. Then we're going to put the strap on it. Once you get the strap on, cut it to length and burn the end so that it doesn't fray away on you. Now we're going to install the actual lube line coming from the tank going down to the blade. We're going to space our clips about 6 inches apart on the frame as we go down. And we get down here to the bottom of the motor. We're going to use a couple clips and just zip tie those to the bottom of the motor mount. As you notice, there's two valves in this lube line system. The valve up by the tank, you want to cut a piece of hose about 2 inches long and mount that first valve up there. That is your actual flow adjustment for when you're sawing. So you'll adjust your flow rate there. Then your second valve goes right down on the frame in front of you by the motor. When you get to that valve in front of the motor, you want to put a clip on either side of it close. That way it won't move around on you in warmer weather. And that valve is just your on-off. So you'll set your flow rate for your cutting speed. And then when you're sawing, you just hit your on and off in front of you for quick and ease of turning off your lube and not having to adjust it every time you turn it on. Okay, our next step is installing the top blade guard and the end guards on your sawmill. We're going to start with the top blade guard. Secure your hardware kit with the nylon washers and the nuts. The nylon washers go on first. Set them on your pegs and set your center guard right over the top. That's your top blade guard. Put on your flat washer and your nuts. Just snug them up, don't tighten them at this point. There's a slot cut in the top of that guard. Kind of center that guard in the center of that slot. Now we're going to move down to our end guard. Again, put your nylon washers on top of the studs so that they're on the frame. We have a half guard and a full guard on the drive side of the sawmill. On the half guard, there's a stud at the bottom, and in the kit of the washers, nylon washers, you'll see one with a flat side on it. That goes on the bottom. Slip that up and then put the guard over the top of the nylon. Again, your flat washers and your nuts. Snug them up. Again, on the full guard, put your nylon washers on the studs and slip the guard over the end of the band wheel and cover that up. Once you get that on, again, put your flat washers. And on this end, we have what we call an extended nut. One side gets the regular nut, but in the center, you can't reach in there, so we made an extended nut. Make sure you put the flat end against the guard and tighten that right up. And on the end of that extended nut, there's another nut where you can put your wrench on it to make it easy to take it off and on when you tighten it. And then we're going to move along to the other end and do the same thing. Put your nylon washers on, put your guard on, flat washers and nuts, tighten it up. Once you get those tightened up, you want to center them in the slots when you do put them on. Then go back to your blade guard on top and line that up with your end guards so everything looks nice and straight as you look down across the top of the mill. Once everything is lined up, go through and make sure you tightened all the bolts on your guards. Next, we're going to install the measuring tape and the decals. First, we're going to do the measuring scale stick. So you want to tear a little piece off the top of the scale sticker and put it on the back like we show here in the video. This helps you adjust it when you're putting it on the actual bar. Then go right over to the scale stick bar on your sawmill. You want to line the one up on the line that is on your sight glass. So you're looking straight at it and you're looking straight in. That should be on the 1 inch mark. That gives you your 1 inch off deck. You can stick it on there with that little piece that you got taped at the top where we peeled the backing off to hold it in place. Then start peeling down the back, strip off your tape and work it down the bar. Make sure you don't stretch the tape as you're pulling it because that'll throw your measurements off. Just leave it slacked and pull it evenly and adhere it as it goes down nice and straight with the scale bar. Once you get to the bottom, just pull off your tape and secure it and it all should be set, but make sure you don't stretch it when you're putting it on. Go back up to the top, raise your head up a little bit, pull that little tab off the back and rub your sticker on good. You want to make sure you don't have any bubbles or creases in the decal when you put it on. Then you want to crank your head up a little bit and check your head for being straight again. You can see that your scale stick is not moving left or right. We know we're good and square, and when you set it down it should fall back down and come up onto the 1. At this point the mill is fully assembled. Make sure all your guards are in place and we're going to do a test run. Never run the sawmill without all the guards in place. It is too dangerous. So first we're going to open up the main adjustable blade guide, bring it all the way open, lock it in position. Then go ahead and start your engine up. Let it idle for a minute. When it's down at low idle, your blade should not be turning. Got to make sure of that your idle is set low enough. And then we're going to go ahead and start speeding it up once it gets warmed up for a minute. Bring it up to speed, let it run for a minute, bring it all the way up to full throttle, listen for any vibrations, make sure all the guards are tight, any loose bolts. If you see something loose, shut it down, make the adjustment. After you do that, shut the sawmill down, and we're going to put it away like we're going to store it, like you would every day after you're done cutting. You want to shut your sawmill down and loosen the tension on the blade. You never want to store your sawmill with tension on the blade. It'll create flat spots on your band wheels. It'll cause you trouble later on down the road. So set your head all the way down every night when you're done cutting and take the tension off the blade. And you're all set to go ahead and start sawing.